All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating historical investigative report, treating it essentially like a political science case study. We're going to explore how systemic governance failure and, just crushing urban poverty didn't simply lead to crime. No, they actually birthed an entire parallel government, a literal shadow state right in the heart of Mumbai. So, here's a quick look at our agenda. We'll start with the roots of the shadow economy, then look at Haji Mastan and the early dawns, followed by Dawood Ibrahim's massive syndicate. After that, we'll map out the crime-politics nexus, break down the pivotal 1993 power shift, and finally, look at the lingering echoes of urban trauma. Take a look at this quote. It perfectly hits the nail on the head for our core political science thesis today. The state had failed these people. The underworld had not. When we look back at early Bombay, organized crime wasn't just some random anomaly, right, or a moral failing. It was straight up a survival economy. As historians point out, bootleggers and gang leaders were stepping up to fill a massive structural vacuum left totally emptied by the state. So it wasn't chaos, it was survival. Okay, Section 1, the roots of the shadow economy, bootleggers and the mill country. Back in the 1940s, Bombay was getting hit by a total perfect storm of socioeconomic factors. You had the city literally flooding with migrants pouring in from Uttar Pradesh, Goa, and the Konkan villages, all looking for work in the textile mills. But here's the catch. These mills paid absolute poverty wages. You combine that kind of severe deprivation with Maharashtra's really strict prohibition on alcohol, and, well, you've just created a massive market gap. The crucial takeaway here is that in cramped, impoverished neighborhoods like Nagpada and Kamatipura, early bootleggers stepped right in. And they weren't just selling liquor. They were providing jobs, handing out loans, offering protection. They became the social safety net because, frankly, the official institutions had completely failed to provide one. Moving on to Section 2, Haji Mastan and early dawns seeking legitimacy. So look at the striking contrast between two defining figures from Bombay's first golden age of organized crime. On your left, we've got Haji Mastan. This guy arrived as a migrant teenager with just 30 rupees in his pocket and somehow built an absolute fortune smuggling gold. But here's the fascinating part. Mastan desperately craved institutional legitimacy. He wanted to be seen as a respected community patron, so he donated heavily to mosques and hospitals and cultivated these really deep ties with Bollywood. Now look at the right. Karim Lala operated in a totally different universe. He ran things like a traditional quiet feudal lord ruling the Dongri area with pure, unquestioned authority. Mastan's approach, though, it ended up establishing this really dangerous template, blurring the lines between crime, glamour, and social work, a template that a younger generation was about to completely weaponize. Which brings us to Section 3, Dawood Ibrahim's Syndicate, the institution. Born in Dongri in 1955 to a police constable, Dawood Ibrahim watched those older dons and basically realized, hey, your methods are completely outdated. Dawood was fiercely strategic. We're talking a guy who was always seeing 3 moves ahead. He took his gang, D Company, and transformed it into a highly structured institution. He pivoted away from, petty smuggling and went all in on massive extortion and real estate. He built alliances exactly the way a modern political party would, and crucially, he used Bollywood. Back then, film financing was entirely opaque. No public audits, nothing. So it was the literal perfect vehicle to launder illicit money. He wasn't just funding movies, he controlled the entire distribution network, and he violently punished any producer who dared to tell him no. But all of this institutionalization, it came with a truly horrific human cost. Look at that number, 500. That staggering figure represents the number of people killed in gang-related violence in Mumbai between just 1985 and 1993. As D Company clashed violently with rivals like the Pathan gang, street shootings and bomb blasts just became an everyday reality. The city's homicide rate absolutely doubled. So Dawood's power didn't grow in spite of this urban chaos, it grew because of it. Let's dig into Section 4, the crime-politics nexus, complicity and architecture. To understand how a democratic state actually allows this kind of parallel governance to exist, you really have to look at systemic complicity. Think of it like this. It's the builder, politician, don triangle. In Mumbai, land is absolutely everything. Gangsters essentially became landlords by violently controlling the slums. So if legitimate builders wanted to redevelop that incredibly valuable land, they couldn't just get a permit. They needed the don's informal permission, or a no-objection certificate. Meanwhile, the politicians desperately needed the Don's massive illicit wealth to fund their election campaigns, and in exchange, the politicians provided police protection right back to the Don. It's wild. Crime, capital, and politics became totally inextricably fused together. If you need hard proof of just how deeply this nexus ran, listen to this quote from a former top police officer. Honest cops who successfully built files on these top gangsters would suddenly find themselves transferred out to the middle of nowhere, to remote districts, and their investigations would just instantly go cold. As the officer noted, this was not accident. This was architecture. It wasn't a broken system at all. It was working exactly as designed to protect the powerful.
All right, Section 5, 1993, the power shift.
13. That is the number of bombs that exploded across Mumbai on one single afternoon, March 12, 1993. This is the exact pivot point in our historical case study where the gangster fundamentally transforms into the terrorist. Let's quickly walk through the timeline of that terrible day. Starting right around 1:30 p.m., coordinated explosions ripped through the most iconic commercial and cultural hubs of the city. We're talking the Bombay Stock Exchange, Haji Ali, the Air India building, Hotel Sea Rock. In the aftermath, 257 people were dead and over 700 were injured. Impartially analyzing the facts here, this specific day forced a massive, unavoidable restructuring of power dynamics. The state, which had basically turned a blind eye to Dodd Company for years, could no longer ignore a syndicate that had literally just provided logistical support for mass terror. In the fallout, Dawood Ibrahim fled to Karachi, which fundamentally altered the entire structure of the underworld. The train claw back control of a city that was rapidly spiraling into terror, the state kicked off what became known as the Encounter Era. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, specialized police squads, led by officers like Dayan Nayak and Pradeep Sharma, began neutralizing suspected gangsters in shootouts. The police called them encounters, but human rights groups, they labeled them extrajudicial executions. It's a highly complex legacy. The state utilized officers who were operating well outside standard legal frameworks. And sure, that diminished the immediate gang threat, but it birthed entirely new systemic controversies, including serious allegations that the police were sometimes basically operating as hitmen for rival businesses. So with Dawood out of the country and these encounter cops roaming the streets, the unified shadow state completely broke apart. D Company fractured. What we saw instead was the rise of these smaller, hyper-local kingdoms, run by entirely new names, guys like Chota Rajan, Arun Gali, and Abu Salam. The whole era of the untouchable Grand Don was over. It was quickly replaced by this atomized network of contractors and killers for hire. The Mafia didn't vanish by any stretch. It just dispersed, adapted, and went local.
Which brings us to our final section, number 6, Echoes of Urban Trauma, What Remains.
You know, it's really easy to just look at the raw numbers and the political structures from a distance, but we have to ground this in lived reality. Read this quote from a survivor of the 1993 blasts. The ground moved. The glass came down like water. People were screaming, but I couldn't hear anything. The city was never the same after that day. Today, a lot of younger generations might consume these events as, stylized myths on streaming shows. But for the survivors, that visceral terror remains very real. The psychological architecture of the whole city was permanently altered by the violence inflicted on its citizens. And while those Grand Dons are now dead, jailed, or living in exile, their legacy is quite literally cemented into the physical city. Why this matters for us today is that the massive capital generated through decades of extortion, smuggling, and terror didn't just evaporate. It laundered itself into absolute legitimacy. The physical structures built by crime outlasted the criminals themselves. Today, that shadow money sits quietly right inside Mumbai's soaring commercial real estate, its booming film industry, and its deep political funding networks. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely crucial thought. Cities carry their histories invisibly. Mumbai is this magnificent, incredibly resilient city that has undoubtedly endured. But endurance is not absolution. When we look up at a skyline that was built at least partly on a foundation of shadow governance and systemic failure, we really have to ask ourselves, what was the true social cost, and who were the everyday citizens forced to pay the ultimate price? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the structures around you.